All right, welcome everybody to the third of our free webinars. This one we are focusing on somebody new. The last two we did Aristotle. This time we're going to be talking about Epictetus, and we're looking at probably one of the biggest introductory doctrines for Stoicism, I think, that's out there in present modern day Stoicism. In fact, some people go so far as to portray it as being the whole of Stoicism, so we're going to talk quite a bit about this. Here's how I've got the webinar set up. I'm going to do a few introductions. We'll talk about the Stoics in very, very broad terms, Epictetus a little bit. Those of you who don't know me, I'll do a quick introduction to myself as the presenter. And then I've got 5 main topics that I thought would be good for discussion today in this free 45-minute webinar. So we'll talk about the dichotomy itself and what is on both sides of it. And then we'll talk about what the consequences are for getting it wrong and getting it right and how we do that. We're going to look at some common objections and challenges, which should rise to everybody's mind, I think, when first reading through this. And we'll look at a particularly interesting proposed way of addressing those challenges that William Irvine put out in his book several years back. And then we'll talk about how Epictetus himself addresses those challenges in looking at this concept of use, and we'll examine a few examples. I've reserved 20 minutes for question and answer and discussion, so we should have plenty of time for that. I'll ask everybody to hold their questions until the end. When it does come time for a question and answer, I'll remind everybody about this later on, that you can either use your mic or text, but I'd ask everybody to keep their mics muted for the time being, because we don't want to get feedback, and we are trying to record it. So let me move on then into talking about Stoicism itself. So Stoicism is one of several main schools in ancient philosophy. And it's not as old as some of them, although it's only a few generations younger. It gets started by this guy Zeno, who is not originally from Greece, and he winds up, as the story goes, shipwrecked, reads Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is about Socrates, asks where he can meet somebody like that, is pointed out one of the cynics of the time, khresis, and follows him and learns from him for quite a while, but he also learns from others. And he, in effect, produces a new synthesis. And what ends up happening is there are a few people who spin off with their own doctrines from him, but they don't really last. There's a clear progression from Zeno to Cleanthes, and then Chrysippus, who's often called the second founder of the school. What we're interested in with respect to Stoicism here today is how we'd apply it in contemporary life. And that brings me to the third point here. So there have been revivals of interest in Stoic philosophy. It caught on again in the Renaissance and the early modern period, so you'll see modern philosophers talking about the Stoics quite a bit, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, and then it kind of went back into decline. But in the last 20 to 30 years, it's taken on a whole new impetus and interpretations, in large part because of the internet. This could be something interesting to talk about in the Q&A. So let's talk about Epictetus now. You notice that I'm calling him a late Stoic. So he's somebody who is part of the development of Stoicism in its last stages. There was the early Stoa, the people that we were talking about before with Zeno and Chrysippus. Then there's the middle Stoa. These would be people like Posidonius and Panaetius. We get to know them in part through Cicero. And then there's the late Stoa. And the late Stoa are the people whose books we actually have. Unfortunately, we've lost most of Stoic literature. So you can see when he's living, he's in, roughly the early part of the Roman Empire. He's born into slavery. He winds up studying Stoicism with Musonius Rufus, some of whose works we still have. He winds up becoming freed and eventually becomes a teacher of Stoic philosophy. He's forced to leave Rome because at a certain point they kick all the philosophers out, and he settles in Nicopolis and starts teaching there. Now, the works that we have by him are not actually by him. They are, you might say, transcripts of the things that he taught and said in classes. The Discourses is much longer, but we don't actually have all of the books. And then the Enchiridion is sort of a best hits list. All of these are set down by his disciple and friend Arrian. I'm Greg Sadler. Those of you who, I think quite a few of you looking at the guest list here know me already. I'm president of a company that puts philosophy into practice and provides these sorts of workshops and webinars. I'm also the editor of Stoicism Today, so I'm somebody who has a role in the modern Stoic movement, oftentimes just behind the scenes. I design and teach courses on Epictetus and Stoicism. And I apply Stoic philosophy and work with individual clients and organizations and institutions. So what I find is that, that's quite helpful. Learning about where people encountering Stoicism run into the snags is something that I pay a lot of close attention to. And this doctrine that we're going to look at today seems to be one of those. So let's talk about the dichotomy itself. This is called, in contemporary stuff, the dichotomy of control. It's not what Epictetus himself called it. It was something that you might say he didn't call by any name because he took for granted that it was so basic for his students. And he makes this distinction in Enchiridion chapter 1 and then in Discourses book 1 chapter 1, but there's a lot of other places where it keeps coming up. And the best way to translate it perhaps is what is in our control and what is not in our control. As you can see, the Greek words here are epumon and uk epumon. Ep means upon or towards, and then the humon is just the pronoun for first person plural, us, right? And so there are some things that are up to us, we could say, or are not up to us. He's not the only person to use this distinction, by the way. Aristotle had used it earlier in the Nicomachean Ethics, but hadn't done quite so much with it. We might think about other ways that we could translate this. So in our control, in our power, those are pretty synonymous. Another way of translating it that I kind of like is what's our business and what's not our business. When we say to somebody, I think that this is particularly your business, this is something that you should be focused on, we mean that. Or we sometimes say, that's none of your business. And we often say this to try to put people off, but Epictetus might be saying this in part to indicate what we shouldn't be concerned with. So, making the distinction, you notice that we've got two sides there, and we could think of them as two opposed sides. But when I was considering this, I thought, well, we really have not so much two things on one side and on another, like two hands, but rather we have the inside and the outside, the inside of a person and the outside of a person. So that's another way of parsing out this distinction. When we look at what he actually says, you'll see that it conforms to this, right? What is in our control? You notice I've got a few Greek terms there, and I'll explain those a little bit. So what we translate as conception or sometimes assumption, hupolepsis, that's coming from the word lambanen, meaning to grab, and hupolepsis had become a technical term for something like what we assume to be the case. Choice, or another way of translating this is impulse, horme, This is another word that we see the Stoics bringing up a lot. And then desire and aversion. Those are all things that Epictetus says are in our control as examples. And then he has this sweeping term. Whatever is our own doing, hosa metra erga, whatever is our own function, whatever is our own deed. So that sort of supports that, our business. In other places, he talks about the ruling faculty, to hegemonikon, which includes the rational faculty and the faculty of choice. These are all really connected with each other. That's another topic we can go into. That's something within our control as well. He talks about this in Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1. And he talks about this as being a faculty that has the capacity for choice and refusal, desire and aversion, and the use of external impressions. We're going to come back to that word use in a bit. So if that's what's in our control, what's not in our control? Well, the body is an example of something not in our control. What else? Property, khresis in Greek. And this will extend to a lot of things. Reputation, doxa in Greek. Positions or offices, the Greek word for that is archai, literally being in a rulership position. So you might think of not just political office, but if you get a promotion at work or not. And then there's another catch-all, whatever is not our own affair. And we might think about this more broadly as what is determined by other people or by fate, or the processes of the universe. And Epictetus stresses to us that we're in a position of having to choose one thing or another. We can focus on what's really in our control, or we can focus on what is not in our control. Or we can try this quixotic thing of trying to focus on both of them. And he says if you do that, it's not going to work. We can't do two things at once. And this is not just doing two things at once in a moment, but doing two things at once in the course of our life. He says you need to pick one side or the other. So moving on, what are the consequences for getting this right and getting it wrong? There are different consequences depending on where we put our focus. And he will spell that out for us. We're also going to have to be concerned with another thing, which is whether we're getting the distinction right in the first place. He actually, this is a bit of sort of side note trivia, but Epictetus talks about another thing that people get quite confused about, which are general conceptions or preconceptions. These are sort of broad ideas that we have that he says everybody possesses. They don't contradict each other in themselves, but they do when we go to apply them because they're kind of confused in our heads. This distinction of what is in our control and what is not in our control, these are, he says, preconceptions. So we can't take it for granted that we automatically get it right in every single case. What Epictetus says is that if you focus on the things that are not in your control or in your power, you're going to be, and he uses this term, hindered. Things are going to interfere with you. You're also going to experience negative emotions, and you'll blame the gods and human beings. On the other hand, if you focus on things that are in your power, he says, nobody will ever be able to compel or hinder you. You will blame and find fault with no one. You'll have no enemies, and nobody will harm you. And all of that sounds pretty wonderful, doesn't it? So what does getting it wrong mean? Well, it means having a mistaken understanding of what is in and what is not in our control. We often think that some things are in our control when they're really not. We can know this on a, you might say, cognitive level, but not on a practical level. And Epictetus thinks that because of this, when we have desires and aversions, those are going to go out to things that we think are in our control. So if we're mistaken about this, we're going to be having all sorts of desires and aversions about things totally outside of our control. we'll also then start making choices and longer-term commitments, prioritizations, you might say, weighing one thing against another, sacrificing one thing for another. And these are going to have bad outcomes for us. So those are consequences of getting this distinction wrong. Another important aspect of this, the emotions, right? When people feel these emotions that the Stoics view as negative emotions or as problematic, it's often because they're focused on things that are outside of their control. So fear or anxiety, right? When we're preoccupied with what could happen to us and either trying to do something about it, or just feeling anxiety because we can't do anything about it, we have the wrong attitude towards things that are in our control, or that are not in our control, rather. Sadness or grief fits in with that. Envy or jealousy. When we're envious of other people, we're being envious of things that are really none of our own business. Jealousy is wanting to hold on to something that somebody else might try to take away from us. But if it can be taken away, it's not really in our control. Anger is a particularly interesting one because anger not only occurs in relation to things that are outside of our control, but anger also tends to make us believe for the moment that we actually can control things. Like we can make the other person see the way that we want them to see things, or impose the retribution that we demand, or we can actually get back what we lost. Irrational pleasure. The Stoics think that you should, in fact, feel some measure of rational pleasure or joy, but when we feel far too much, there's a tendency for the things that we found pleasant, we want to have more and more and more and more of them. And very often those are things outside of our control. Shame or embarrassment. Epictetus thinks that a lot of the time that we're embarrassed about things that we really shouldn't find embarrassing. Great example is poverty. Epictetus himself, who lived as a slave and was poor at plenty of times in his life, and who lived simply during his life, said, it's not the poverty itself that's really shameful. It's the things that you might do in order to try to get out of it. This is in the Discourses, or your worries about other people and how they perceive you. So the emotions fit in there. And then there's this hindrance idea. When we're hindered, this is a term that's coming from like being hobbled, having your feet chained together or something like that. Something else interferes with us and our desires and our aversions and our plans. Now, we can easily be hindered in anything that's external to us. For example, if we have to do a group project and we want it to go a certain way, this is one reason why students hate to do group projects, other people can interfere with that. They can let us down. They can screw the project up. They might deliberately interfere with it. There's a personality conflict. Or they can just get in the way. You're having a committee meeting about it, and you just can't get this other person to shut up. They might not do what we want. And then there's the whole realm of external objects that do what they do and thereby interfere with us. They don't work the way that we would like them to work, and we feel as if they are against us. Some people so far as to think that the weather is against them, or gravity should be working differently than it does. Epictetus gives us some advice about getting it right. And so here's two bits that are coming from the Enchiridion. He says that with every harsh appearance, we should examine what the appearance is and determine whether it's about something in or outside of our control. So notice that some appearances could be about things inside our control. If we look at ourselves in the proverbial mirror, not just looking at our reflection, but thinking about ourselves, and we're like, I don't like this tendency that I have towards overeating or losing my temper or not following through on things. That's in our control. So that would be a harsh appearance that we might not say this to. If it's outside, then we ought to be ready to say it's nothing to me. That's his bit of advice. That's tougher to do than it sounds, but we'll talk about that in a bit. In Enchiridion 2, he's got this really interesting discussion of desire and aversion. And he says that we should withdraw aversion from what is not in our control, and this should be actually transfer aversion to what is in our control, but what is bad. So if I don't like the fact that I'm careless in how I spend money, because I have desires for things or aversions that are getting me into trouble, and I don't like to think about that, maybe I need to transfer my aversion to that so that I dislike that aspect of the way I'm living and then start to try to change that. He says that we should also try to remove desire entirely from things that are outside our control. And like I put here, that's extremely tough to do. So we have to think about that in gradual steps rather than all at once. Now, this raises, here's the third topic, a lot of objections. Students will often say things like, wait a second, you're saying my body isn't in my control, but I choose whether I wash it or feed it properly or exercise or sleep instead of watching shows all night long. And Epictetus actually grants something like this in Discourses 4.1. This is another thing where he's talking about. He says, things can be not under our control in a couple different ways, whether we have them or don't have them, or whether we have them with a certain quality, or whether they have, like I can have a coffee, I choose that. I don't choose necessarily whether the coffee is hot or good or anything like that, or to have in a certain way, in relation, you might say, to other things. So those are important clarifications. And we might make some objections, right? Don't we have control over our body? It seems like we do to some extent. What about finances? I choose whether I save or spend. Personal relationships, I choose whether I'm in personal relationships or not. My career, whatever that happens to be, it seems like I have some measure of control over that. Like if I know that I need a particular degree or certificate, it's up to me to go get it, and if I don't get it, then that's up to me. Reputations or legacy, those all seem to be real objections. And we might also go the other way. What about things that are in our control? Do we really want to say all of our desires and aversions are totally in our control, or our emotions, our emotional responses are totally in our control? Our opinions and judgments, can we decide that something that we think is the case really isn't the case or not? Maybe Epictetus is wrong about this sort of stuff. So the question that we want to ask is whether Epictetus has responses to this. If he doesn't, then we've got a real problem with this distinction. So Epictetus doesn't say that we shouldn't care at all about external things, and we're going to talk in just a little bit about the use of those things. He does say that we're given those things for some time. So, our bodies are our bodies. They're not going to last forever, and we don't control every aspect of them, but they are our bodies. My body is my body, not your body, and vice versa. And notice, too, that being in control does not always mean that we have immediate control over those things. So there are some things where habit plays a very important role. If I know that I have a tendency to eat more than I should and I look at it and I say, well, I'm having these snacks as I watch a show at night to unwind. Maybe that's where I need to cut back. I start modifying my habits. And at first it's very difficult to modify habits, right? So we have to engage in what Epictetus calls ascesis. This is a Greek word that means training or discipline. And so some things are under our control, but not under our control in the sense that we can change them by turning on the proverbial dime. We have to steer a ship. He likes this metaphor. Steer a ship that actually takes a while to turn. So now another way of trying to deal with this is proposed by Bill Irvine. He has a book called A Guide to the Good Life. And he says that the phrase, some things aren't up to us, is ambiguous. It can be understood to mean either there are some things over which we have no control, or there are things over which we don't have complete control. And so this leads him to propose a trichotomy. as opposed to a dichotomy. So notice that he's adding in a third category, things over which we have some but not complete control. And the key question to ask for this is, can we get the same effect from Epictetus' dichotomy? Should we go Irvine's path, or should we stick with Epictetus himself? The real issue is that middle category, right? What is partly in our control. We control one aspect of this, but not the other. So the way Irvine talks about this is we control the intention, but not the results. And he calls the process of dealing with this internalizing the goals. So for example, he likes to talk about tennis. He must, I imagine, play quite a bit. And he'll talk about playing to your best ability. You have control over that, whether you play to your best ability, but you don't control whether you win the game or not, because you could still be a terrible tennis player, right? And your good could be just, quite awful. Or you could be playing against a pro, or the wind could be against you, or, you could add up all sorts of other things. Now, I think that Epictetus already has resources for addressing this sort of thing and for making the kind of distinction that Irvine is proposing. So if we look at his discourses, he tells us at a number of points that externals as such are not within our power, but the use of those things outside of our control is something that we do have control over. And this word use is in Greek khresis, and use is a really good way of translating it, but another way we can translate it is dealing with. It's what we do with things. And Epictetus says that our use ought to be prudent, it ought to be proper, we have certain guidelines for this. So here's some examples, right? With our body. We should, in fact, make proper use of and care for our body. He's got a chapter on cleanliness in the Discourses where he says, well, you actually should, clean your body because it's like any other possession. You want to keep it in good repair. And we might say the same thing about wealth or property or reputation, position in offices. How we use these things impacts what's really at our core, which is this faculty of choice, or proiresis. It has important implications for that. Now, here's one example that he has that I think drives this home. This is in Discourses 2.5. He says, you can make a voyage. You decide you're going to Egypt, for example. And taking voyages in ancient times was kind of perilous. So you do have control over some things. You control what ship you get on. You control the captain and the crew that you're willing to hire for this. If they're drunk all the time, maybe don't take that ship. And you can control the time to sail. And Epictetus says you should, in fact, pay attention to these things. Once your ship is sailing, though, the storm can come up and you can be shipwrecked. It could turn out that the sailors lied to you and they don't actually know how to sail. There's all sorts of things. Provided you've done your due diligence, you can actually say, well, I did what I ought to have done. Another great example is playing ball. This is also in Discourses 2.5. And he says we should imitate the skilled ball player. He doesn't worry about whether the ball is good or bad. He focuses on catching and throwing the ball skillfully. And actually, if you start thinking too much, playing ball is a great example, you start thinking too much about how you're playing ball, that often interferes, doesn't it, with playing skillfully? Now, here's where it becomes a really interesting metaphor. Socrates was playing ball in the law court during his trial. How did he do that? Well, if you read the Apology, whether Xenophon's or Plato's, you'll see him cross-examining the people who accused him and showing that their charges don't really have any merit, but not in such a way that he would win the case. As a matter of fact, he managed to alienate the jury pretty clearly, if you've read it. And you might say, what was he doing there, right? Well, he was focusing on something else. He was focusing on remaining true to his principles, not on whether he won or lost. This is time that we've got set aside for questions and answer. I ran a little bit over time. Andy is going to, I think, field some of the questions that will come up in the chat window. So if you want to ask questions with that, that's great. Otherwise, you can unmute your mic, and I should be able to hear you with that. I think we have a few questions in the chat.
There's nothing in the chat yet, Greg. I just posted that people could post a question there if they needed something read aloud. It could be that people are typing, though. That's the one thing. We don't know if someone's typing a question right now or not.
Well, let me then, in the meantime, I always have much more material than I bring out in these, because there's quite a lot of material associated with this. Let me talk about another really interesting example that Epictetus has, which I'll be talking about in a interview later on next week. So he's got an example of a kithara player, and a kithara is a musical instrument. This is somebody who's playing and singing at the same time. And he says this person is really good at this. He's practiced. He's got that muscle memory. He knows exactly where his fingers go. And so he feels confidence. He doesn't feel anxiety about his performance. When he's practicing, he's just fine. When he's in an empty room, he's just fine. Put him in front of a crowd, and now suddenly he gets worried about that. And Epictetus says, what's going on there? He clearly knows what he's doing. He's got talent. He's got skill. So why is he worried? And he says he becomes worried because he starts to be preoccupied with something that's outside of his control. He knows that he can play well. He doesn't know how the audience is going to respond. And because he allows himself to get concerned with what the audience response is going to be, his entire emotional comportment changes. It goes from being confident to being anxious. It goes from knowing that he's up to any challenge that he's going to run into to worrying about what the crowd is going to think. And there's all sorts of cases in our own lives where it's precisely like that. Think about when you put together a presentation for, at work, and you've got to present a proposal, and your proposal is really good. But going in front of that audience, you don't control what their responses are going to be. And if you become preoccupied with that is where your good and your bad lie, then you're going to feel some worry or something else. Maybe you project some anger towards them. Who are they to judge me? Or you get sad or other things arise.
Hey, Greg, we've got a couple of questions in the chat window. Derek says, where to read more on ascesis, training according to the Stoics?
Oh, well, so I mentioned that Musonius Rufus, who is Epictetus' teacher, we still possess some writings by him. We have these lectures and these fragments. He talks about it quite a bit, and he actually gives some interesting guidelines, particularly pertaining to food and drink and how we ought to behave. Epictetus talks about it at a number of points in the Discourses. You'll see it mentioned in the Enchiridion, but you're not getting a lot of discussion about it. But yeah, in the Discourses, there's some discussion of it also in Marcus Aurelius. Seneca has a lot of useful things to say about it as well. I'm not sure actually what the Latin term, it might be disciplina or something like that. And I'm trying to recall whether there's any in-depth discussions in Cicero, who is not a Stoic himself, but who gives us a lot of information about the Stoics, but I'm drawing a bit of a blank on that. But if you dig around in the Discourses, if you only pick one source, I would say go to Epictetus' Discourses and just start reading around, and you will find him talking quite a bit about what ascesis would comprise.
We have two more chats. Johanna just said thanks for the Greek words and their meanings. I know that that's very helpful. And Lawrence asks, are Kant's ethics related to Stoicism?
Oh, okay. Well, let me actually first say, Johanna, you're very welcome. I always have to watch that I don't lapse into too much Greek words because it's a tendency, but it is useful to have them in front of us. Now, Kant. Okay, so Kant is an interesting guy. Kant is known as being, one of the big deontological thinkers, and deontological thinkers stress many of the same themes that Stoicism does, like fulfilling your duties, right? And that the intention is really what matters, that we don't have control over the ultimate effects or outcomes in many cases. The whole notion of freedom and freeing ourselves from irrational desires and living a rational life. All of that can sound very Stoic or it can sound very Kantian. I would say that the key difference is in how Kant understands what all of this would mean. So for the Stoics, for example, we have certain impulses within us as creatures by being the kind of creatures that we have. So one great example is what we call familial affection, in Greek philostorgia. The Stoics thought that parents naturally feel affection towards their children, and that's a good thing, and we ought to do that. And Epictetus actually has a great chapter in, I think it's in, if I remember right, it's in book 1, I want to say it's like 12 or 13, about philostorgia, where he's clarifying with a guy who's claiming that his bad behavior is motivated by that. Epictetus says, no, that's something quite different. Kant would say that that's morally valueless. Kant thinks that the only thing that gives something moral value is that it is chosen as a rational action for its own sake. It's a little bit more technical than that when we get to it. But so you could say that with Kant there are some interesting similarities, but that he's doing a whole different kind of thing.
I think that's it for questions for now from the chat box, but I'll certainly let you know if anything else pops up in the next Q&A.
Okay. Well, one other thing that I'll mention too, since we brought up a modern philosopher, Kant, and I did mention that Stoicism had kind of a revival in the Renaissance and then in the early modern period. I think a lot of early modern thinkers were very attracted to this distinction between what is in our control and what's not in our control. You see it playing a role, for example, in René Descartes' ethics. He doesn't do it quite the same way as the Stoics do, but he does in the Meditations and in a few other works where he's laying out some ethics. He is using that same distinction and saying we get in trouble when we focus on things outside of our control. We need to stick to the things that are.
We do have one more question, Greg. It's sort of connected to what you were just talking about, if you wanted me to read that now or table it. Okay, so Lawrence asks, is Stoicism something that is still evolving as society moves on in any ways, or is it mostly set in stone?
Oh, that's a big question. And it's actually something I've been thinking about quite a bit, both in general and in relation to this particular issue of what's in our control and what's not in our control. So let me put that stuff on the side for the moment and just try to give a very general answer. There are people in the present who call themselves traditional Stoics or Orthodox Stoics, and they view Stoicism as essentially cast in stone. They sometimes disagree a bit about how much you have to buy into, and they treat it almost in a quasi-religious way. As a matter of fact, one group actually has an ordination process for becoming an ordained Stoic philosopher. So that would be at one extreme. Then there are people who are what we might call, if I'm going to pick little titles for them, Stoicism Light or Smorgasbord Stoicism, right? And it's very much a matter of I just use the little bits that help me and say forget all the rest. And oftentimes their basic direction, their basic orientation may be at odds with some of the other things that the Stoics say. In the middle, and the middle is always messier than extremes, right? Are people who are having this conversation about, like, well, what parts of Stoicism might we need to adapt differently? What parts might we need to get rid of altogether? What parts do we need to not only keep but insist upon? That's where I think a lot of the people like, say, Donald Robertson or Massimo Pigliucci or Bill Irvine find themselves, is in that messy middle. And that's the most interesting place, I think. So now that said, we do live in a culture that is changing very quickly. And when it comes to what's in our power and what's not in our power, I think that this distinction is going to have a lot of really interesting applications. So let me give you two examples that I've been thinking about. What's not in our power, our body, right? And we might say, well, wait a second. You know, I have so many things I can do to my body that show how much I do control it. You know, we know so much more about exercise and its principles. We have all these great technologies that we use in medical things. And you can say, sure, you can do all that, and you can still drop dead tomorrow. And we're now at the point where, because of our control, our semi-control over things, think about antibiotics, we have exercised so much pseudo-control over, you know, parts of the living world, that we now have bred superbugs. And you can get these sometimes by going into the hospital. So people go to the hospital, the place where you're supposed to go to get cured, and come out with antibiotic-resistant staph infections, and sometimes die of it. So we find ways in which, even though we live in this incredibly advanced technological society, it keeps getting driven home to us that things are ultimately not in our control if they're really externals. Another example of this would be our technology that we have, like think about our iPhones and all this, video conferencing, and think about where it's going to be 20 years from now, where we probably will have quite a few implants, and we're going to be enhancing our abilities in so many different ways. Now, to what degree do we remain in control, and at what point does the technology begin to control things much more? I think a Stoic perspective is very handy for doing this futuristic kind of thinking, because it starts out with an assumption about minimal control that's counterintuitive to what many of the people making predictions about this tend to hold, which is that, well, if we can push a button, we control it. There's so many things that can go wrong and go overboard. I think if Epictetus were around today, he would be talking with the futurists and probably deflating some of the optimistic bubbles that they're doing. And I think that's a good thing. So that's what I'll say about that. I see that there's some more questions.
Yeah, so Randall says, it strikes me that the Buddhist idea of impermanence and accepting it fits with the notion of not focusing on things out of our control.
Yeah, I would say that there's a similarity there, and there's also a big dissimilarity in that, for the Buddhists, ultimately there isn't a self in the traditional sense where we can talk about it as being like the core of the person, whereas for the Stoics there definitely is. It's that ruling principle or our principle or our faculty of choice, however we want to parse these out. So there, and the other thing is, Greg Lopez has a really nice piece on this recently in Stoicism Today, comparing Buddhist and Stoic notions of attentiveness or mindfulness. And so there are similarities, and then there are some really big dissimilarities as well. But this is the last thing I'll say about it. There's quite a community of people who are drawing these connections and sort of working them out in practice. So we're fortunate that we have a number of people. I'm not one of them. I don't know enough about the stuff to say anything really effective, but there are a number of people who are doing some pretty cool research into this.
Okay, we have one more comment here with a question. And Derek says, I've been interested in Stoicism for about a year, and I still find the idea that I don't have control over things like success to be odd. Did the ancient Stoics assume that people just naturally worked at being successful? It seems like they must have acknowledged that some things take some work, planning, goals, etc.
Yeah, and like I said, Epictetus does think that, let me put it to you this way. There are definite ways that you can make sure to not be successful, right? If you walk around in the marketplace with your pants on your head and throwing watermelons at people, nobody's going to hire you unless there's some weird job description for that sort of thing, right? And nobody's going to put you in political office. They may elect you to, village idiot or something like that, but I don't know if that counts as success unless you really desire that. So there's certainly things that we can do to make success not happen, but there's a lot of things that we would have to do if we're striving after something external. And so Epictetus talks, for example, about somebody who's going to Rome and is going to be in a law case, and how they'll probably need to do this and do that, including, making a particular argument to the jury and bribing the judges or whatever. And he also talks about trying to get political appointments in Rome, too, and how you're going to have to need to grease the wheels, either with affection or money or something like that. So there is a clear recognition that there are some things, if what you're really after is people calling you a good guy or giving you an office or thinking, wonderful things and spreading your fame far and wide. There are things that you can do, but none of them are guaranteed to actually be successful. You're also doing so in a environment where other people are doing the same thing, so you're competing with them. And even if you do get those things, you're probably not going to be happy. So whatever measure of seeming control you have over success is it's not the same sort of control as we have over whether we really are good people or not, or work upon ourselves or anything along those lines. I think that the ancients weren't very different than us in those respects. They had clear ideas about what you needed to do to get ahead. The question is how you evaluate it. And remember, too, that Epictetus is saying something countercultural in his own time, just as he is in our time, in saying that that's not where your attention should be focused.
Okay, Greg, that's it for now, and I'll make note of any new chat comments that come in as we move through the next section.
Oh, no, we're at the end. That's all right. You're thinking of the 2-hour seminar. Let me actually move up to that then. So okay. Useful Epictetus resources on the same topic. We're going to have some 2-hour online seminars on Epictetus and the Dichotomy of Control. We're going to look at a lot of other examples, and we're going to go more into depth on some of these issues. Those will be May 10th. I've got them set at 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. I tried to make it so that people worldwide could attend as easily as possible, but I do think that there's a zone where it's still a little bit tricky for people. We also have online courses in the ReasonIO Academy. There's a free Epictetus' Enchiridion course, which is, I think now got about 600 people enrolled in it, so it actually qualifies as a MOOC. And we'll have an Epictetus Discourses class coming soon. This is a on-demand, work-at-your-own-pace course with lots of resources and videos. And then, of course, some of you have probably already poked around in there, but I do have a Stoicism playlist in my main YouTube channel, which now has around 95 videos, and I'll be adding some further ones later on this month. So those could be quite handy for further follow-up on this. So let me say thanks for all of these great questions. I really enjoy doing this sort of stuff, and have a great rest of the day, everybody.